Something extraordinary is unfolding in Washington at this moment, and it isn't being driven by Democrats. For the first time in a long while, resistance is coming from within the Republican Party itself. Lawmakers are beginning to quietly, deliberately push back against Donald Trump, attempting to slow or block the authority he is trying to gather at any cost. Emergency proclamations, language more fitting for wartime, and frantic conversations happening far from public view, Congress is no longer standing idle. It is moving to establish boundaries. This is not simply another partisan clash or a fleeting headline. What is happening right now is a fundamental test of whether power in the United States is restrained by law or shaped by the impulses of a single individual. Stay with me until the end, because the developments unfolding here could permanently alter how authority functions in America long after the news cycle moves on. Imagine Washington late at night, the Capitol mostly quiet, but phones across offices suddenly glowing. Aides murmuring urgently behind closed doors, senators refreshing their screens repeatedly, rereading the same messages, trying to confirm what they are seeing. Because the President of the United States is angry, not at Democrats, not at journalists, but at members of his own party. And for the first time in years, the pressure isn't coming from protests outside the gates. It's emerging from within. That is always where the most serious danger begins. Republicans are turning against Donald Trump. And no, this is not the familiar pattern of MAGA infighting or anonymous briefings meant to unsettle donors. This shift runs deeper. It is colder. And it carries far greater consequences because it targets the one thing Trump believes he cannot function without: unrestricted authority. The importance of this revolt extends beyond broken campaign promises, though there are plenty of those. From vows about avoiding new wars, to economic assurances, to long-promised revelations that never materialized. What makes this moment distinct is that Republican lawmakers themselves are actively working to restrain the power Trump is determined to retain. When internal safeguards activate, presidents rarely respond calmly. They escalate, they dramatize, they invoke crises. That is exactly what is happening now. A presidency leaning heavily into spectacle and emergency language to shield itself from internal fracture. At the center of this uprising lies a deeply unsettling reality that even seasoned veterans of Washington politics hesitate to articulate openly. The President of the United States has publicly entertained the possibility of using military force in ways that could pull America into conflict. Not with a distant enemy, but with its own allies. When Senator Chris Murphy spelled this out plainly, it sent shockwaves through Washington. Because once the branding and bravado are stripped away, what remains is a scenario that sounds implausible only if one forgets that dismissing such statements as jokes is no longer an option. Greenland is not an empty square on a property map. It is part of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally, and NATO's foundational principle is collective defense. Any military action involving that territory would not be symbolic posturing. It would create a legal and strategic crisis that could theoretically place the United States in direct confrontation with Europe. The fact that lawmakers now feel compelled to explain this reality to the public reveals how distorted the conversation has become. No American voted for a presidency that risks armed conflict with allied nations over territorial rhetoric. Yet here we are dissecting remarks, weighing hypotheticals, and watching members of Trump's own party quietly but firmly attempt to shut the door before it is forced open. To understand the backlash, it's essential to understand Trump's worldview. He does not interpret geopolitics through alliances, treaties, or shared defense commitments. He views it through the lens of ownership, leverage, and pressure. As though international relations are transactions that can be forced if one pushes hard enough. That mindset may function in a corporate boardroom. In global politics, it leads to casualties. Republican senators are aware of this. They understand that once military action is framed as an option, the machinery begins to move, regardless of congressional comfort. That is why the War Powers Act has suddenly become the focal point, not as a theoretical constitutional debate, but as an emergency brake. And when that brake was applied, when Republicans joined Democrats to advance a resolution limiting the president's unilateral authority, Trump did not respond with persuasion or compromise. He reacted with anger, profanity, and threats. Because when someone who believes power is personal realizes it is conditional, the response is rarely measured. The reported phone call to Senator Susan Collins was not merely about a single vote. It represented the shock of discovering that loyalty has boundaries, that even within his own party, there are lines that cannot be crossed without resistance. For Trump, that resistance feels existential. His entire second strategy depends on projecting dominance, inevitability, and total control. Nothing disrupts that image faster than members of his own party publicly refusing to comply, especially on issues involving war, authority, and constitutional limits. From here, the narrative accelerates. Faced with resistance, Trump does not retreat, he reframes. He reaches for emergency language, declaring extraordinary measures not only as policy tools, but as political weapons. The declaration of a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets fits neatly into this pattern. It allows him to position himself as the sole guardian of national security while casting dissenting lawmakers as obstacles. Even though the underlying reality is far more complex. Long timelines, massive corporate interests, uncertain infrastructure, and benefits that would largely flow to multinational energy companies rather than everyday Americans. But complexity has never been the objective. Control is. Emergencies shift the rules. Emergencies centralize authority. Emergencies divert attention away from uncomfortable questions. And few questions are more uncomfortable for this administration right now than why promised transparency initiatives have stalled, why document releases are delayed, and why bipartisan pressure, rather than executive leadership, was required to advance oversight. When lawmakers like Sheldon Whitehouse begin speaking openly about inspectors general, compliance failures, and missed timelines, it signals something important. Not a verdict, not an accusation, but concern that the process itself is breaking down. That concern is precisely what Trump cannot tolerate. His political survival issue depends not on overwhelming the public, flooding the information space, and ensuring that every controversy competes for attention. These threads, the Republican revolt, war powers disputes, emergency declarations, and stalled disclosures, are not separate narratives. They are facets of the same story, a presidency attempting to outrun accountability by accelerating disorder. And Republicans who once enabled everything are now calculating the cost of silence, weighing institutional damage against party loyalty, and recognizing that if they fail to act now, the system they inherit later may be unrecognizable. Once a president openly suggests that his judgment supersedes law, treaties, and precedent, the issue ceases to be partisan, it becomes structural. That is the moment Washington is now confronting. Behind closed doors, Republicans are asking whether stopping Trump constitutes betrayal or preservation. History does not remember who defended power the loudest. It remembers who intervened when the rules were bent beyond repair. This rebellion, subtle in some places and explosive in others, may represent the first serious sidecast, not triggered by opposition forces, but by those who understand firsthand how dangerous unchecked authority becomes when wrapped in grievance, spectacle, and perpetual emergency language. As the internal resistance deepens, the real story shifts from Trump's public statements to Republican actions behind the scenes. Away from cameras and social media outrage, there is growing recognition among GOP lawmakers that this is no longer a conventional presidency. They are dealing with a leader who views every institutional limit as a personal affront. That realization is altering behavior in ways that would have been unimaginable a year ago. When the War Powers Resolution advanced with Republican support, it was not accidental or impulsive. It was a calculated decision by senators who understand that if unilateral military threats become normalized, particularly toward allied territory, Congress becomes irrelevant unless it reasserts itself. That fear is constitutional, not ideological. The War Powers Act exists for precisely these moments, when presidential instincts outpace institutional safeguards. Trump's response, laced with intimidation and political threats, only reinforces concerns that his decision-making is driven less by strategy than by impulse. An obsession with legacy. Legacy matters here. Trump's fixation on how history will remember him, on appearing dominant and transformative, has increasingly clashed with the reality that his promises have not delivered stability or restraint. When rhetoric about avoiding new wars collapses under aggressive language, even loyal supporters begin to fracture. Wars are not abstractions. They are costs, risks, and consequences. Republicans facing re-election understand that no branding can repackage conflict with allies as success. Trump's reliance on emergency powers increasingly resembles panic rather than leadership. Emergencies allow him to bypass debate, marginalize dissent, and frame opposition as sabotage. This tactic has historical precedent globally, where leaders sensing erosion of authority reach for extraordinary measures to freeze political reality in their favor. The Venezuelan oil emergency exemplifies this pattern. Economic assets are reframed as security imperatives. Even when practical benefits are distant and uncertain, emergency language is not about feasibility. It is about optics, control, and dominance of the narrative. While the administration insists this move protects American interests, lawmakers from both parties perceive something else entirely, a strategic diversion intended to pull attention away from oversight, internal fractures, and increasing scrutiny over executive performance. This is where Trump's relationship with his own party turns openly adversarial. He does not merely seek backing, he demands obedience. When senators assert independence, he interprets it not as governance, but as betrayal. He threatens their careers in public while privately relying on them for confirmations, legislation, and institutional cover. That contradiction exposes the fragility of authority built on fear rather than coalition. Power structured that way inevitably collapses inward. We are witnessing that collapse in real time. Republican senators are quietly coordinating, sharing concerns, and determining where to draw boundaries that once seemed impossible to establish. Their calculations are driven by a broader fear that Trump's rhetoric surrounding law, morality, and authority is no longer symbolic but operational. When a president suggests personal judgment supersedes constitutional and international constraints, it signals a worldview where rules exist only when convenient. That prospect terrifies lawmakers who understand precedent outlives presidencies. Once norms erode, they rarely restore themselves. This anxiety has transformed routine votes into flashpoints, private calls into confrontations, and policy disagreements into existential tests of institutional survival. All of this is unfolding amid mounting public exhaustion, where voters struggle to distinguish spectacle from substance. That confusion is not accidental, it is strategic. Chaos benefits those who thrive within it. Trump has long understood that when everything is urgent, nothing is accountable. That is why the convergence of these developments matters so deeply. The war powers dispute, the emergency declaration, the Republican revolt, and the delayed disclosures are not isolated events. They are interconnected fractures in a system being stretched beyond its intended design. Republicans who once excused every decision as tactical or temporary are now confronting a harder truth: silence is no longer neutral. Inaction becomes consent. This realization has shifted the party's internal posture from loyalty to triage. Lawmakers are no longer asking how to protect Trump from the next headline. They are asking how to prevent irreversible harm to institutions that must function long after his tenure ends. That shift is subtle but profound. It is driven not by ideology, but by alarm. Once that boundary vanishes, reclaiming it comes at a cost. That cost is what Republicans are now attempting, perhaps belatedly, to avoid. Even as Trump escalates his attacks and frames every check on his authority as an assault on the nation itself, in his view, the two are inseparable. And that belief, more than any single policy dispute, is what has finally driven members of his own party into open resistance. It sets the stage for an internal confrontation that will define not just this presidency, but the future balance of power long after the headlines disappear. While public debate rages over war powers and emergency declarations, a quieter and more troubling pressure is building underneath. Each escalation in crisis language inadvertently illuminates what the administration seems most eager to escape: oversight, documentation, timelines, and accountability. This is where the story shifts into darker procedural territory, not conspiracy or rumor, but the uncomfortable realm of process failures and unanswered questions. When lawmakers begin asking why promised disclosures are delayed, why reviews stretch endlessly, and why statutory deadlines lapse without explanation, they are not drawing conclusions, they are identifying warning signs. Warning signs are dangerous not because they prove misconduct, but because they demand scrutiny. And scrutiny is the one thing a presidency built on speed, dominance, and spectacle struggles to withstand. The sensitivity surrounding delayed document releases stems from the administration itself elevating transparency into a defining pledge, only for urgency to lag far behind rhetoric. When senators publicly highlight discrepancies between expectations and outcomes, focusing on timelines, numbers, and compliance rather than theories, the issue transforms. It becomes an administrative credibility test. And credibility is the currency of governance. Once questioned, every explanation encounters skepticism. Calls for Inspector General review are not accusations. They are acknowledgments that something within the process failed, whether through mismanagement, delay, or competing priorities. For an administration already facing internal revolt, such inquiries intensify pressure. Inspectors general operate beyond political theater. They deal in records, memos, and decision chains. Their findings do not vanish with rallies or tweets. This pattern clarifies Trump's strategy. Whenever scrutiny intensifies, the narrative expands. Emergencies are declared, external threats are emphasized. Attention shifts from documentation to dominance, from compliance to confrontation. It is not subtle. It is reflexive, a strategy refined over decades. Overwhelm, redirect, escalate, and hope attention moves elsewhere. But Congress is not an audience, it is a co-equal branch, and some lawmakers are beginning to behave accordingly, pursuing subpoenas, tracking financial pathways, and asking why transparency measures were not pursued proactively if they were truly prioritized. This is not about reaching predetermined conclusions, it is about explaining a process. Processes are indifferent to emotion. They rely on records, and records are stubborn. As inquiries deepen, they increasingly collide with Trump's preferred approach: personal control over narrative rather than institutional disclosure. That collision limits his ability to redefine reality at will. It explains the intensifying rhetoric around loyalty, the framing of dissent as sabotage, and the portrayal of bipartisan oversight as partisan warfare. Accepting neutral review means accepting outcomes beyond one's control. For Trump, control has always equated to survival. This brings the story back to why Republicans themselves are so uneasy. They see the convergence. War powers challenged, emergency authority questioned, disclosure process examined, party unity eroding simultaneously. This is not merely a bad week. It is a systemic stress test, asking whether institutions still function when pressure originates at the top rather than from external threats. Some Republicans now quietly admit the greater risk is not what investigations may uncover, but what happens if oversight fails entirely. Systems unable to examine themselves become brittle. Brittle systems do not bend, they break. This awareness has shifted conversations from defense to distance, from justification to insulation. Lawmakers are attempting to separate constitutional responsibility from a presidency that increasingly treats those responsibilities as impediments. Meanwhile, Trump presses forward, portraying himself as besieged and unfairly constrained, leaning ever harder into destiny and personal judgment. But institutional machinery moves differently. Oversight accumulates, paper trails persist, deadlines remember, processes remain indifferent to loyalty. That is why this moment feels heavier than previous controversies. It is no longer about what Trump says, it is about what he cannot fully command. For a leader whose authority is dependent on narrative dominance, the quiet persistence of oversight may be the most destabilizing force he has faced. This is where the story ultimately arrives. Not at a single vote or phone call, but at a reckoning that can no longer be deferred. What we are witnessing is not merely political drama. It is a test of whether American governance still functions when pressure comes from within the highest office. The reason this moment feels different is that the resistance is institutional, procedural. Lawmakers across ideological lines increasingly recognize an uncomfortable truth. Power justified solely by personal will, shielded by emergency language, and enforced through intimidation, ultimately undermines the system that grants it legitimacy. Republicans understand that today's shortcuts become tomorrow's precedents. Those precedents will not belong to one man or party. They will belong to whoever follows. That realization has transformed quiet unease into cautious action, votes cast for restraint, oversight framed as necessity, distance created not out of disloyalty, but self-preservation. Trump senses this shift. His rhetoric sharpens, his framing grows more apocalyptic, his reliance on emergency powers deepens. Leaders who feel control slipping do not slow down. They accelerate. They demand loyalty tests. They insist only they can prevent collapse, even as their actions generate instability. This paradox defines the final phase of this presidency. A leader consumed by legacy, constrained by process. A party divided between immediate alignment and long-term survival. Institutions forced to choose whether they will function or perform when it matters most. For observers, it may be tempting to dismiss this as another chapter in a familiar political saga, but that misses the point. The central question is not who wins the next argument. It is whether the rules governing power remain stronger than those temporarily holding it. That question belongs to everyone. As this revolt continues, as oversight advances, and as emergency narratives collide with constitutional limits, the outcome will reveal where American democracy truly stands. Not in theory, in practice. Systems do not fail overnight. They erode gradually until someone finally says no. Right now, that refusal is coming from within. From Republicans who understand that stopping a leader from going too far is not betrayal, it is responsibility. Whether that responsibility holds will shape not only this presidency, but the authority every future president inherits. That is why this moment matters. Why it demands attention beyond outrage, and why the real story is not in declarations or threats, but in the choices made when power meets its limits. For more politics updates, subscribe, Discover Alert.